At dawn on October 25, 1944, the sea east of Samar lay deceptively calm.
Low clouds clung to the horizon, bruised purple and gray by the first thin light. The water was flat, almost polished, broken only by the slow, disciplined wakes of American ships moving in formation. This was Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, a small escort group guarding vulnerable carriers supporting the Leyte landings. They were not built for a fleet action. They were built to protect others.
Sailors stood watch in damp uniforms, breath fogging in the morning air. Coffee steamed on open decks.
Somewhere below, engines hummed steadily, a constant mechanical heartbeat. Radar screens glowed softly inside darkened compartments, operators scanning for contacts that were not expected.
Intelligence had said the Japanese surface fleet was spent, broken, retreating.
The men of Taffy 3 believed they were hunting remnants, not standing in the path of a storm.
The escort carriers, thin-skinned, lightly armed, rolled gently in the swell.
Their decks held aircraft meant for close air support, not for stopping battleships. Around them steamed destroyers and destroyer escorts, including USS Johnston, her steel hull streaked with salt, her 5-inch guns trained outward. She was fast, aggressive, and outmatched by anything heavier than a cruiser.
Her crew knew it. They also knew their place in the line. To the west, beyond the curve of the earth, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force was moving hard through the night. Battleships Yamato and Nagato, heavy cruisers, and destroyers cut through the dark at full speed. Their guns were loaded. Their crews were awake. Their mission was simple: break through and annihilate the American carriers off Leyte.
At 0645, the illusion shattered.
Radar contacts bloomed where empty sea should have been. Lookouts raised binoculars and froze.
On the horizon, masts rose, too many, too tall, moving fast.
Sunlight caught on pagoda towers and heavy gun turrets.
This was no scouting force.
This was an armada.
Orders crackled over radios. Men ran to stations. General quarters sounded, sharp and unforgiving.
The calm vanished in seconds, replaced by urgency and disbelief. Taffy 3 was staring at the main body of the Japanese fleet.
And there was no room left to run.
Taffy 3 was never meant to face a surface fleet.
It was a support group, a thin screen stretched across open water to guard escort carriers flying missions for soldiers fighting ashore on Leyte.
Its ships were light, fast, and lightly armored. Their job was to protect aircraft, not to trade blows with battleships. Yet at sunrise on October 25, 1944, the small American force found itself alone between the enemy and the invasion.
6 escort carriers steamed in a loose column, their flight decks crowded with FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers armed for ground attack. They carried few armor-piercing bombs. Their aircraft were low on fuel, their pilots already in the air or preparing for routine sorties. Around them moved a fragile ring of protection, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. USS Johnston cut through the water at the edge of the screen, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. She was one of the few ships fast enough to maneuver aggressively, but speed could not change the balance of power. The crews knew what they were up against the moment the enemy was identified.
Battleships carried guns larger than anything Taffy 3 possessed. Heavy cruisers could outrange them, outgun them, and absorb punishment they could not return.
Armor that measured in inches faced thin steel plating meant to save weight and increase speed. Every man aboard understood the truth immediately: if the Japanese fleet broke through, the carriers would die first.
Smoke generators were ordered ready. Gun crews swung 5-inch mounts toward the west. Torpedo men checked gyros and warheads with steady hands.
The wind carried the smell of oil and salt as ships increased speed, wakes widening behind them. Radio traffic spiked, short, clipped transmissions layered with urgency. There was no time for long explanations. The situation spoke for itself.
From the bridge of USS Johnston, the horizon looked wrong.
Enemy ships grew larger by the minute, their formations tightening as they closed.
Splashes erupted ahead as ranging shots fell short. The first enemy salvos were probing, measuring distance, preparing to kill. Johnston's crew watched towering columns of water rise and fall, each one a reminder of what would follow when the aim was true. Taffy 3 did not turn away. There was nowhere to go that would not expose the carriers. Instead, the screen tightened. Destroyers edged forward, forming a moving wall of smoke and steel. Orders were relayed without hesitation. This was the shield, and shields existed to take the blow. As Japanese guns elevated and the range closed rapidly, USS Johnston surged ahead of the formation, accelerating into danger, toward a fight no destroyer was supposed to survive. As the sun climbed higher over the Philippine Sea, the full scale of the threat revealed itself. What had first appeared as distant silhouettes now resolved into unmistakable shapes: towering pagoda masts, massive gunhouses, thick armor belts riding low in the water. This was no raiding force. This was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, intact, aggressive, and closing fast. Battleships led the line, flanked by heavy cruisers and destroyers in disciplined formation, their wakes cutting sharp scars across the sea. Lookouts shouted confirmations from every ship in Taffy 3. Range estimates tightened. Identification flags snapped in the wind. The names spread quickly across American radios: Yamato, Nagato, Congo-class battleships, cruisers bristling with 8-inch guns. These ships carried firepower designed to break fleets, not chase escort carriers. Their hulls had absorbed punishment in earlier battles and kept fighting. Now they were here, unopposed, and hungry for targets. The first full salvos came moments later. Battleship guns thundered, the sound rolling across the water like distant storms. Shells screamed overhead and crashed down in towering columns of white water, some close enough to drench American decks. The shockwaves hit before the spray settled. Men flinched, then steadied themselves. This was the sound of annihilation measured and delivered by the ton. On the American side, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. 5-inch guns could not reach the ranges the enemy commanded. Torpedoes required dangerous proximity. Armor was thin, designed for speed, not survival. Yet there was no panic. Orders were repeated calmly. Smoke screens were laid thicker. Course changes were executed with precision. Training held where fear might have taken over. Enemy ships continued to grow larger, details sharpening with every passing minute. Gun barrels elevated deliberately. Fire control directors tracked American movements with mechanical patience. The Japanese fleet was maneuvering to cross the American line, to pour fire down the length of the formation and crush it quickly. It was textbook naval doctrine: overwhelming force applied with ruthless efficiency. From the bridge of USS Johnston, the view was stark. The enemy's lead ships dwarfed her, their wakes rolling outward like tidal waves. Each salvo walked closer, splashes tightening around the formation. Time compressed. Decisions that would define the battle were seconds away. Radio messages confirmed the worst. This was not a reconnaissance element. This was the main body. There would be no friendly battleships riding to the rescue. No heavy cruisers to blunt the blow. Taffy 3 stood alone. And as the armored giants closed the distance, their guns now fully trained, the question was no longer whether the Americans were outmatched, but who would be willing to move first, straight into the teeth of the fleet. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Captain Ernest E. Evans stood forward, binoculars steady despite the violent motion of the ship. Born in Oklahoma, a Cherokee officer who had fought his way into command, Evans had drilled his crew for moments exactly like this. He did not wait for permission that would never arrive. Reports were clear. The enemy was bearing down. The carriers astern were exposed. The screen had to act. Evans ordered flank speed. Johnston surged ahead, turbines screaming, the bow lifting as the destroyer leapt toward the enemy line. Signal flags snapped. Smoke generators were engaged, pouring thick gray curtains across the water to blind Japanese fire control optics. 5-inch mounts trained hard to port as the range closed. The ship vibrated with power and purpose. This was not a maneuver taught in peacetime manuals. It was a deliberate decision to interpose steel and lives between battleships and carriers. Evans understood the math. A Fletcher-class destroyer could not duel heavy cruisers, let alone battleships. But torpedoes did not care about armor thickness. Smoke did not ask permission. Aggression could buy time where armor could not. Fire control teams fed data rapidly. Gyros spun. Warheads were checked one last time as Johnston cut across the enemy's van. Japanese shells began to straddle closer, splashes marching in. The sea turned violent, pocked with eruptions. Johnston did not slow. She angled in, presenting a narrow target, every knot of speed wrung from her engines. Evans pressed the attack. The destroyer's guns opened, sharp cracks swallowed by the roar of incoming fire. Shells burst against cruiser superstructures, starting fires, forcing course changes. The enemy line hesitated, formations deforming as smoke thickened and targets blurred. Minutes mattered. Each one kept carriers alive. Then the range collapsed. Johnston reached torpedo distance. Tubes swung out. Compressed air hissed. A full spread raced across the water, white wakes cutting straight for towering hulls. Almost immediately, enemy salvos found the mark. Steel screamed. Plates buckled. Men were thrown from their feet as hits tore into the ship. Evans was wounded but remained on the bridge. Blood darkened his uniform. The order remained unchanged. Keep charging. Keep firing. Keep them busy. Johnston's speed fell, but her will did not. She turned again, guns still answering, smoke still pouring, a single destroyer acting as if she were a fleet. Damage reports flooded in from below decks as Johnston absorbed punishment meant for larger ships. Power flickered. Communications lines were severed and rerouted by hand. Medical teams worked in passageways slick with oil and seawater, treating burns and shrapnel wounds while the deck above shook. Gun crews stayed at their mounts, loading and firing through smoke and debris, training overriding fear. Every maneuver drew fire away from the carriers, every minute gained mattered. Evans kept Johnston angled toward the enemy, daring them to focus on him. Helmsman fought the wheel as shockwaves slammed the hull, refusing to yield control under relentless fire and smoke around them. As Japanese guns reloaded and the next salvos arced toward Johnston, the destroyer drove deeper into the enemy's killing zone, committing fully to a fight that could only end one way. USS Johnston drove straight into the heart of the storm. Her bow cut through smoke and spray as enemy shells crashed around her, the sea erupting in violent white towers. At full speed, the destroyer surged toward battleships built to crush fleets. Every second shortened the range. Every second increased the chance of death. No one aboard misunderstood what was happening. This was a charge meant to draw fire, to disrupt, to buy time with steel and blood. The Japanese battle line loomed massive and steady, gun barrels already elevated, fire control systems tracking the small American ship with cold precision. When the next salvo landed, it landed true. A shell slammed into Johnston's hull, ripping metal apart and flooding compartments. Another detonated near the bridge, spraying shrapnel across the superstructure. The ship shuddered but held course. Engines roared, refusing to die. Johnston answered with everything she had. 5-inch guns fired in rapid succession, their sharp concussions lost in the thunder of battleship fire. Shells struck cruiser superstructures, tearing through exposed positions, igniting fires, forcing evasive maneuvers. Smoke thickened, blinding optics, breaking firing solutions. The Japanese formation began to bend, ships turning away from torpedo tracks that might already be in the water. Then Johnston reached the moment she had been built for. Torpedo crews worked with brutal focus, sweat and salt streaking their faces. Tubes trained. Gyros locked. With compressed air and recoil, torpedoes leapt free, racing across the sea toward towering hulls. White wakes cut through smoke like knives. Enemy ships turned sharply, emergency maneuvers breaking formation as they tried to escape the unseen warheads beneath the surface. The cost was immediate. Battleship and cruiser guns refocused, pouring fire into the charging destroyer. Hits followed hits. Steel screamed. Deck plates buckled. Antennas vanished. Fire spread across the ship as damage control teams fought blindly through smoke and debris. Men dragged wounded shipmates away from shattered mounts while others stepped into their places without hesitation. No one abandoned their station. On the bridge, Captain Ernest Evans remained upright despite his wounds, issuing orders through the chaos. Course changes were shouted, repeated, executed.
Johnston twisted and turned, presenting a narrow target, forcing enemy gunners to constantly readjust.
She was no longer just a destroyer.
She was a moving distraction, a threat that demanded attention. Enemy salvos walked closer again. One shell detonated near the waterline, flooding engineering spaces and stealing speed. Another tore into a gun mount, killing and wounding the crew instantly. The ship slowed, but she did not stop. Smoke continued to pour from generators and fires alike, merging into a single choking cloud around her. Johnston turned once more toward the enemy, guns still firing, her silhouette half hidden in smoke. Japanese ships hesitated, commanders unsure how many American torpedoes remained, uncertain of the strength of the force opposing them.
That hesitation mattered. Behind Johnston, escort carriers turned south, desperately launching aircraft armed with whatever ordnance they could carry.
The destroyer's sacrifice was working. Enemy fire remained fixed on her, shells meant for carriers slamming into a ship already torn apart. Johnston absorbed punishment far beyond her design limits, her crew holding the line through discipline and sheer refusal to yield. As another massive salvo roared toward her, muzzle flashes lighting the smoke ahead, USS Johnston pressed forward again, burning, battered, and still charging into a wall of fire that threatened to erase her from the sea.
Smoke swallowed the sea as USS Johnston cut back across the enemy's path.
The destroyer was wounded now, burning in places, slower than before, but she remained lethal. Torpedoes had already forced the Japanese formation to twist and scatter, and that disruption spread outward like a fracture through steel.
Heavy ships turned away from phantom tracks.
Fire control solutions dissolved inside the smoke. The neat geometry of an armored armada broke apart under pressure from a ship that refused to die.
Johnston's guns kept firing. 5-inch shells slammed into cruiser hulls and superstructures at ranges no destroyer was meant to survive.
A shell struck a Japanese cruiser's bridge area, sending smoke and debris skyward.
Another burst near gun mounts, silencing them temporarily.
Each hit forced hesitation, every hesitation stole momentum.
What should have been a clean, overwhelming advance turned into confusion and delay. Enemy fire answered brutally. A heavy shell ripped through Johnston's midsection, detonating deep inside the ship. Compartments flooded instantly. Power failed and returned in flickers.
Men were thrown against bulkheads, ears ringing, lungs burning from smoke and cordite. Damage control parties moved without waiting for orders, sealing ruptures, fighting fires with hoses in bare hands, dragging the wounded through narrow passageways slick with oil and seawater.
Smoke continued to pour from Johnston, deliberate and accidental, wrapping the destroyer in a shifting gray cocoon.
Japanese gunners fired blind through it, shells crashing down where Johnston had been moments earlier. The destroyer used that blindness ruthlessly, altering course again and again, refusing to present a steady target. Her silhouette vanished and reappeared like a ghost, always closer than expected.
Behind her, other American destroyers and destroyer escorts joined the fight. USS Hull and USS Heermann surged forward through the smoke, launching their own torpedo attacks.
The sea became a maze of wakes, splashes, and drifting clouds.
Japanese commanders faced threats from multiple directions, unsure where the next strike would come from. Orders collided. Signals overlapped.
The line fractured further.
Johnston pressed through the chaos, crossing directly in front of the enemy formation. This was the moment that mattered most. Torpedo tracks forced battleships to turn away, heavy cruisers to slow and maneuver, guns to cease fire while solutions were recalculated. The Japanese advance stalled, not because it had been defeated, but because it could not see clearly enough to continue safely. Enemy shells found Johnston again.
A hit smashed into a gun mount, killing its crew instantly.
Another tore through the deck, sending fragments across the bridge area. Fires spread unchecked in places the crew could no longer reach. Speed fell again.
The destroyer's ability to maneuver narrowed with every blow. Still, she stayed between the enemy and the carriers. Captain Ernest Evans remained exposed, directing the fight despite blood loss and smoke choking the bridge.
Reports reached him piecemeal: guns down, engines damaged, casualties mounting.
His response did not change.
Keep the enemy occupied. Keep them turning. Keep them firing at Johnston. Japanese ships hesitated longer now.
The smoke, the torpedoes, and the unexpected ferocity of the American screen suggested a stronger force than actually existed.
Battleships altered course repeatedly, fearful of running into underwater death. The moments slipped away. The opening they needed to annihilate the carriers closed.
American aircraft began appearing overhead, launched from escort carriers that should have been destroyed already. They carried depth charges, machine guns, and whatever bombs were available.
Not ideal weapons against battleships, but enough to harass, distract, and add to the sense of encirclement. The Japanese fleet found itself under pressure from sea and sky, its advantage bleeding away minute by minute. USS Johnston paid for every second gained.
Her deck was a ruin of twisted metal, smoke, and fire. Communications were barely functioning.
Guns that still worked fired until barrels glowed.
The crew fought on because retreat was no longer an option, only resistance. As the smoke thinned and the enemy's guns found her again, USS Johnston remained in the center of the storm, her presence alone enough to keep the armored giants turning away, even as the next wave of fire closed in.
USS Johnston was no longer a ship in fighting trim.
She was a wounded animal held together by momentum, smoke, and resolve. Fires burned unchecked along her deck, fed by ruptured fuel lines and scattered ammunition. Her speed had dropped sharply. Steering was sluggish. Power flickered with every new impact. Yet she remained in the fight, refusing to turn away while the enemy still threatened the carriers behind her.
Japanese shells continued to find their mark.
One slammed into Johnston's forward section, tearing open compartments and killing men where they stood.
Another detonated near the aft guns, ripping metal outward and flinging bodies across the deck.
The air filled with the metallic taste of smoke and cordite. The sound was constant: explosions, alarms, shouted reports, the roar of fires feeding on exposed steel. Gun mounts that still functioned kept firing.
Crews worked stripped to sweat-soaked shirts, faces blackened with soot, loading shells by muscle memory as flames crept closer. When one gun was destroyed, survivors moved to another without instruction. Ammunition was passed hand to hand through smoke-choked passageways.
There was no thought of retreat. Only the next shot, the next course change, the next minute to be bought.
Below decks, damage control teams fought a losing battle against flooding.
Seawater poured through shattered hull plates.
Pumps struggled to keep up.
Men worked waist-deep in darkness, shoring bulkheads with timber and steel while shells exploded overhead. Medical teams treated the wounded wherever space allowed, morphine scarce, bandages improvised from torn clothing. The ship lived only because her crew refused to let her die quietly. Captain Ernest Evans remained a visible presence despite his wounds. He moved when he could, was carried when he could not, but never relinquished command. Reports reached him through runners and damaged sound-powered phones.
Guns out. Engines failing. Casualties mounting.
His answers were short and unwavering.
Maintain position. Continue engagement. Do not disengage.
The enemy sensed weakness and pressed closer.
Heavy cruisers shifted fire toward Johnston, their guns hammering her relentlessly.
The destroyer answered with what remained, shells splashing against armored hulls, more noise than damage now, but noise was enough.
Every flash drew attention. Every reply kept enemy fire fixed on her instead of the carriers slipping away behind smoke. Johnston turned again, her damaged rudder fighting to respond. The maneuver was slow, painful, but deliberate. She crossed in front of the enemy one more time, presenting herself as a target no commander could ignore. Japanese salvos followed, walking closer, bracketing the ship with brutal precision. One shell exploded near the waterline, flooding more compartments and stealing the last of her speed. Smoke thinned as generators failed, leaving Johnston exposed.
Her silhouette stood stark against the sea, burning, scarred, defiant.
Enemy guns locked on without obstruction now. Hits came faster. The deck became a maze of wreckage and flame. Communications failed entirely.
Orders were passed by voice and gesture, shouted through smoke and chaos.
Still, the ship fought.
A remaining gun fired until its mount jammed.
Then the crew freed it by hand and fired again. When ammunition ran low, sailors searched wrecked compartments for usable rounds. No one waited for permission. The fight had become personal. At last, Johnston slowed to a crawl. The sea lapped at her shattered hull. Fires raged unchecked. Many guns were silent forever. But even then, she did not turn away. Her presence alone continued to draw fire, continued to buy time, continued to stand between the enemy and the carriers now nearly beyond reach. As Japanese guns elevated for another concentrated strike, USS Johnston held her position, burning, broken, and still refusing to fall back, knowing the next moments would decide whether her sacrifice was enough. USS Johnston could no longer maneuver. Fires raged unchecked across her decks, and flooding spread through compartments that had already been fought over for hours. Smoke thinned as generators failed, leaving the destroyer fully exposed beneath the rising sun. She drifted, wounded and silent except for crackling flames and the thunder of enemy guns aligning for the finish. Japanese cruisers closed the range. Their fire was deliberate now, methodical, aimed at a ship that refused to sink quietly. Shells struck with brutal accuracy, ripping through what remained of Johnston's superstructure. Antennas vanished. Gun mounts were smashed into twisted iron. The bridge area was torn apart, killing men instantly and scattering equipment across the deck. Still, isolated guns answered whenever they could, defiant bursts of sound against overwhelming force. Captain Ernest Evans was among the wounded. He had been hit repeatedly, yet he remained with his ship. When movement was no longer possible and the fight could no longer be sustained, he ordered preparations to abandon ship. There was no panic. The command passed calmly through the surviving crew, spoken face to face when radios no longer worked. Men who had fought together now helped each other toward the rails. The sea closed in quickly. Johnston listed heavily as water poured through ruptured hull plates. Ammunition detonated below, muffled by flooding compartments. Flames crawled along cables and bulkheads. Sailors stripped off shoes and gear, securing life jackets, some pausing to salute the ship that had carried them into hell and held the line. Enemy fire continued even as Johnston lay dying. Shells slammed into the water around her, throwing spray across the deck and into the faces of men preparing to jump. The destroyer shuddered one final time as her keel gave way. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she began to sink by the stern. Men leapt into the water amid oil and debris. The sea was thick with smoke and fuel, burning eyes and lungs. Wounded sailors were supported by those still able to swim. Rafts were cut loose and dragged clear as Johnston's hull slid beneath the surface. The ship disappeared bow last, her battle flag still flying as she went down. Captain Evans did not leave the ship. He was last seen standing on the deck, wounded and refusing assistance, choosing to go down with his command. Moments later, USS Johnston vanished completely, leaving only wreckage, smoke, and survivors scattered across the waves. Above the wreckage, American aircraft circled cautiously, unsure whether rescue or renewed attack would come next. The sea was alive with wreckage, smoke, and men calling out through the haze. Every minute stretched unbearably long as survivors waited, scanning the horizon for silhouettes that might mean salvation or execution. The battle was not yet over. The ocean around Samar still echoed with gunfire, and the outcome of the morning remained uncertain. Smoke drifted low, hiding distant ships and keeping fate just beyond reach. Behind them, the enemy's advance had slowed. The carriers were no longer in sight. The destroyer had done what armor in numbers could not. She had forced the enemy to stop and rethink. As survivors clung to life amid drifting debris, Japanese ships turned away in the distance, and the cost of Johnston's last salvos began to reveal its meaning. The sea off Samar slowly cleared of smoke, revealing an outcome no one aboard Taffy 3 could have predicted. Japanese ships that had charged with overwhelming force now turned away, their formations loose, their momentum broken. Battleships altered course. Heavy cruisers disengaged. The armored advance that should have crushed the American escort carriers simply stopped. Vice Admiral Kurita faced a battlefield filled with confusion. Torpedo tracks had forced repeated evasive maneuvers. Smoke had blinded fire control systems. Destroyers that should have died quickly had attacked with a ferocity that suggested a larger force lay hidden beyond the haze. American aircraft continued to harass from above, striking whenever openings appeared. What Kurita could not see weighed heavier than what he could. He believed he had stumbled into a trap. The truth was far smaller and far more costly. Escort carriers fled south, launching aircraft until decks were bare. Pilots attacked with machine guns, depth charges, and empty racks, diving again and again to keep pressure on the enemy. The illusion of strength held. The sacrifice of destroyers like USS Johnston had bought enough time to turn panic into doubt, and doubt into retreat. Japanese commanders argued across radios and signal flags. Reports conflicted. Fuel levels dropped. Ammunition was expended at a frightening rate. Kurita weighed his orders against the risk of losing his remaining capital ships to unseen threats. The decisive moment slipped away. At last, he gave the order to withdraw. For the Americans, survival came with a staggering price. The sea was littered with wreckage and survivors. Ships burned or sank where they had fought. But the carriers lived. The invasion at Leyte continued. The Japanese surface fleet, once poised for a killing blow, faded back into the Pacific. The meaning of the morning began to settle in. A handful of destroyers and escorts had faced battleships and cruisers head-on and forced them to turn away. Not through superior firepower. Not through numbers. But through refusal to yield. As rescue efforts began and the sounds of battle receded, the realization spread quietly across the fleet. What had happened off Samar would not be fully understood until later. But one truth was already clear. The fleet still existed because others had chosen to die in its place, and the war in the Pacific would never unfold the same way again. After the guns fell silent, the legacy of USS Johnston began to take shape. Reports filtered through command channels, pieced together from survivor testimony and fragmented logs. What emerged was a truth almost unbelievable: a single destroyer, outmatched beyond reason, had altered the course of a fleet action. Courage had substituted for armor, resolve for firepower. In the days that followed, Leyte remained secure. Supplies poured ashore. Soldiers pushed inland. The Japanese surface fleet, bloodied and shaken, would never again mount a comparable challenge. Off Samar, the balance had tipped not through overwhelming force, but through sacrifice willingly given. The men of Johnston were counted, the living and the dead. Captain Ernest E. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, his leadership etched into naval history. Other crews of Taffy 3 received their own recognition, their actions finally measured against the impossible odds they had faced. Official citations spoke of duty and gallantry, but they could not fully capture the reality of smoke-filled decks and seconds stretched into eternity. Long after the war, sailors would study the battle as doctrine failed and character prevailed. Johnston's charge became a case study in initiative under fire, in the power of decisive action when retreat promises survival but surrender ensures defeat. The lesson was stark and enduring. At dawn on October 25, 1944, a destroyer charged battleships and forced them to turn away. That fact did not change with time. It grew heavier, more profound, as distance stripped away noise and left only meaning. The Pacific War moved on toward its brutal conclusion, but the echo of that morning never faded. Somewhere beneath the waves off Samar, a wreck lies silent, bearing witness to a truth every navy understands and few are ever asked to prove: sometimes, the smallest shield carries the greatest weight.